We're continuing our lesson in Genesis with Genesis chapter 4, the story of Cain and Abel. But before we go to the story of Cain and Abel, I'd like for us to actually turn to Matthew chapter 5. Now, Matthew chapter 5 is famously known to be Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, including chapters 6 and 7. And we're going to be in verse 21, oftentimes referred to as the spirituality of the law. So, we know that we have the letter of the law, which is the visible obedience. And so we've described as the spirituality of the law as being the internal or the heart change that takes place. We know that God says to us that He will write the law upon our hearts and upon our minds. And so as we look at Matthew chapter 5, verse 21, it reads that you have heard that it was said by them of old time that thou shalt not kill. And whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. But I say unto you that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. Now, Jesus will go through a number of other different things, including adultery and some other laws, where he basically says this following statement: you have heard, but I say. You have heard, but I say. And oftentimes what we've done is we've basically told people that there's no way that Christ could have come to get rid of the law. He actually came to amplify it. And we use the Sermon on the Mount as kind of an example to show how Christ came to amplify it. But in reality, I would challenge that. And the reason why is because I don't think that Jesus came to amplify it. I think Jesus came to basically tell you what it was meant to tell you the entire time. The problem was that you didn't listen. When Jesus says, you have heard, but I say unto you, he's not telling you something new. In essence, he could be saying, you know, I've told you this before, but you didn't listen. I've shown you this before, but you weren't paying attention. And so as we go back to the story of Cain and Abel, I want you to think, where did Jesus actually get this idea? We've already given it away. It's in the story of Cain and Abel. Think about it. You have heard that thou shalt not kill. That's the commandment, right? But I say unto you that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause is in danger of the judgment. Well, think for a moment. Where was the first murder? Cain and Abel. And where did that murder first begin? With anger. It began with Cain harboring ill intent against his brother. So he's not pulling this out of thin air. The lesson was there from the very beginning. If we had paid attention to the very first murder, we would already know that murder begins not with the hand, but begins in the heart. And so let's go to Genesis chapter 4. It begins with saying that Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and she bore Cain and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. And she again bare his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground in an offering to the Lord. And Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock, and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering. But unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. And the Lord said unto Cain, Why are you wroth? And why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? But if you do not well, then sin lieth at the door, and unto thee shall be its desire, and thou shalt rule over him. Now there have been a number of ideas over the past as to why exactly Abel's sacrifice was accepted and Cain's was not. And so we're going to look at a few of these, and we're going to try to see if we can make sense of any of them. Now, one idea is that what really mattered was his attitude. That Cain brought the sacrifice, he brought the best of what he had, but his problem was his attitude. And so we'll look at, okay, does that really make a difference? So let's assume that I've said, hey, I'd like a glass of orange juice, and you instead bring me some coffee. But you do it with a smile, and you do it with very joyfully saying, hey, listen, I know that you wanted orange juice, but I really think that this coffee will give you a bit more energy for the morning to get your day started. I'd look at you, and do you think I'd probably say, hey, listen, thank you. Your attitude has won me over. Or would I say, well, I appreciate that, but I really do think that orange juice would suit me better at this time. I'd probably do the latter, and many of you would as well. And so I'm not sure that attitude, while very important, really cuts it at this point in time. So the question is, then, what was it? Well, some people say that there's no way that they could have known about animal sacrifice, so it couldn't have been that God had asked them for animal sacrifice. Okay, then where did they get the coats of skins? There had already been a sacrifice. We know that. Otherwise, Adam and Eve could not have been clothed with coats of skins. And I want you to think for just a moment. Now, while we haven't introduced the sanctuary just yet, when you look at the image, at the Garden of Eden, I want us to see if we begin to see some level of sanctuary language. There's this place that is a safe place. Now, when you think of the word sanctuary, what do you think? Well, I think of a wildlife sanctuary. I think of a wildlife refuge. I think of some place that I can go to escape to and be safe. And oftentimes, we think of sanctuary, we think of a building. We think of the temple or the tabernacle. But in reality, its purpose was to veil the presence of God so that he can dwell with us and not destroy us. In a sense, it was a way where we could go to and be in God's presence simultaneously and be safe. And so the sanctuary at the beginning was the Garden of Eden. It was the safe place that God had created for Adam and Eve. Now, what's interesting is that if we read it, it says that he took them and he placed the man from the west to the east into the garden. Then afterwards, he led him from the garden eastward out of the garden. So the movement is ever eastward. When we look at the sanctuary always had its door pointing east, opening towards the rising sun, so that the sun would shine towards the west into the sanctuary. Our way back to God is west, while our way away from God is east. Now, why do I mention this? Because as they would have come out of the garden eastward, the very first sacrifice where God had made them those coats of skins would have been done outside of the garden, because something takes place at the entrance to the garden. It's blocked. It's blocked by a flaming or a glittering sword, and there are two angels that guard the way to the tree of life. Is there another scene where we have a place of refuge, a place of safety, where man is looking from the east inside towards the west, and in the middle is a flaming or shining or glittering presence guarded by two angels? The sanctuary. The sanctuary is already being presented to us, and we see the sanctuary as a way back into God's presence, as a way back into the Garden of Eden where we can take from the tree of life. Thy way, O Lord, is in the sanctuary. And in the same way that we left the garden, God has established a sanctuary for us to return back. And we see that in the most holy place, what existed was God's presence, the Shekinah glory, this glittering, this sparkling, flaming light, guarded by two angels. And what was inside? Well, we have the bowl of manna, we have Aaron's rod that budded, and obviously we have the Ten Commandments. Now, each of these things, I believe, were representative of the things that were in the Garden of Eden, in the center. There's the tree of life, there's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now you have the bowl of manna, which is bread, which is food, and you have the tree of life, which is pleasant to the eyes and good for food. One down. The next thing that we have is we have Aaron's rod that budded. Life from non-life. But it's also in many ways a call of not only Aaron as priest, but a sign of God's authority. In the garden, you have that between the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. You have one that basically says, one was chosen by God for you, and one was not. Now, the reason that Aaron had the rod that budded, yes, it was to show that God can have the power to bring life from non-life, but the other was to show whom God had chosen. You have two parties being represented. One chosen and one not chosen, but trying to usurp authority. You have the very same thing in the center of the garden. You have one, the tree of life, that represents the one that God has chosen. This is the path, walk you in it. And then you have another one. You have the presence of a usurper, one who says, I have the authority, and you don't need to listen to the other. And so the rod that budded is a sign not only of God's authority, but the life-giving power that God has. Remember, one tree leads to death and the other to life. Finally, what you have within the ark are the Ten Commandments. The question is, did Adam and Eve already know what was right and wrong? I believe the answer is yes. I think we've talked about this before. Adam and Eve knew what was wrong because God had told them. You can consider this a very simplified version of the law. God says, you shall touch this, you can't touch this. In many ways, you can also consider the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in conjunction with Ten Commandments. And the reason that I say this, while many may not like it, is because God says this is off limits. Through the Ten Commandments, God tells us a series of things that are off limits. God says with the tree of knowledge of good and evil, don't touch it or you're going to die. God says through the Ten Commandments, especially the last 6 commandments, about things that don't belong to us. Somebody's life does not belong to us. Somebody's property does not belong to us. Somebody's wife does not belong to us. Those things are off limits. Those are not things that we have the authority to take or to touch. And so in many ways, as we look at the symbols that are within the ark, we see these things also within the garden. And so backing up just a little bit, in many sense, we have a foreshadowing of the sanctuary in the Garden of Eden. We have the gate in the east. We have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil right next to the tree of life, which in the Ark of the Covenant, you have these 3 items that symbolize more or less the principles presented by these 2 objects in the garden. You have the presence of God, and you have 2 angels that protect access to the very presence of God, to the very life. And so, in somewhat of an incomplete form, we're already seeing God's plan of salvation being thrown into motion. We're already seeing the beginnings of what will begin to develop into the full sanctuary message that we receive later on with Moses. And so Moses is already putting this in that, hey, I'm not the one who came up with this stuff. This has existed before I was even alive. God had already thought of this way. I'm not making this up. And so in many ways, when we look at the laws that Jesus apparently is amplifying, he's not bringing in something new. He's saying if you've been paying attention from the beginning, you would have already known this, because I've told you before. Are you listening to the story? Follow closely. Pay attention, because I'm telling you many things. Now, the reason that I say all that is because I wanted to give some level of groundwork to the sacrificial system already existing before we actually see it in the sanctuary service with Moses. They're already the foreshadowing of a lot of these things as symbols of what is to come and of the process of salvation. So when we see this sacrifice of Cain and Abel, obviously Abel is sacrificing a lamb. That's what he's bringing. Now, Cain is taking a very different approach. He's basically saying that I don't need to sacrifice a lamb, because a lamb is not my work. That is the problem. In a sense, you could say that, hey, that is an attitude problem, because he's willing to, or I should say he's unwilling, to bring what he's been asked, because he wants to bring what he produces. The mindset that we've talked about before, it is already appearing. The mindset of scarcity, the mindset of achievements. Now let's look at real quick the name Cain. The name Cain, or Cain, means acquired. And even it's said in the Bible, where it says that Eve knew his wife, and she conceived, and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten, or acquired, a man of the Lord. Now, mind you, names at this time are extremely important, because names are more than just, hey, I think that sounds nice. Names within the Bible, names within this time, are names that describe something. And sometimes it could be a projection of the parents upon what they wish for the children, or it could be a descriptor of the character that this person will exhibit throughout their life. That's an interesting name to name somebody. Acquired. Now, why would you think of acquired as a good name to name your child? Hello, your name is gotten or acquired. Now, let's put that with Abel's name, Havel. What does Havel name mean? Havel means vapor. And that's also a very interesting name to name somebody. But I want you to think about a verse. James, the verse that comes to mind, at least to me, is James chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. Within that verse, what we hear is, "What is your life? It is even a vapor, which today is and tomorrow is gone." That seems to describe Abel pretty well. His life in many ways was lived in vain. His life existed for just a passing moment. He's there one day and he's gone the next. What was his life? It was even a vapor, which today was and tomorrow is gone. Abel is mentioned as having brought the best or the fat things of his flock. And what God has desired was not necessarily sacrifice, but obedience. God doesn't care for you to offer him a lamb as much as he wants you to listen to what he's asked you to do. And what he's asked Abel and Cain to do is really what this test is all about. The reason that Cain's sacrifice wasn't accepted is because he wasn't obeying. Now, he probably had a bad attitude as well. That's why he got angry. So we have both working against him. It continues to say in verse 23, "For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king." Now I want you to go towards Genesis chapter 4 again, because we're going to look here, and it's all about rejection and acceptance. If you reject me, I will reject you. But if you accept me, if you obey the words that I have asked you, then you will be accepted. It continues to say in verse 7, as we read, "If you do well, will you not be accepted?" In reality, there wasn't any more simple than that. God comes to Cain and he asks him a very simple question. Why are you angry? And why are you angry with your brother? Are you angry with your brother because I have accepted his sacrifice? Or are you angry with your brother because he did what I asked him to? If you do what I ask, won't you be accepted? So why are you angry with your brother then? Obey. But in many ways, just like Saul, the stubbornness was there. The rebelliousness was there. And it says that and Cain talked with Abel his brother. And it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. You know, sometimes we can avoid some pretty difficult situations and some pretty big mistakes in our life if we would just stop, reason with the Lord, and listen. I think oftentimes the reason we find ourselves in many of the predicaments we find ourselves is because we don't listen. We complicate a lot of things. We justify a lot of things. We reason or rationalize a whole lot of things. And we think that we've got a pretty good reason to do some of the things that we've done, when in reality it goes completely contrary to some very simple revelations that God has given us. God is saying, listen, why are you so frustrated with life? Why are you so angry at other people? Why are you jealous when somebody else is doing well or accepted or well favored? If you do well, if you do what I've asked you, won't you also have acceptance? But if not, and here's the kicker, sin lieth at the door, and its desire is for you. Now I want you to think of something else. Who else is at the door? Who else is at the door? Let's go to Revelation chapter 3, verse 20. "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice and open the door, I will come into him, and will sup with him, and he with me." Back to Genesis chapter 4, we have something else lying at the door, and that is sin. What we understand is that there's two things at the door. One is sin, and one is God. One knocks so that he may enter, and one is crouching, waiting for you to come out, that it can ambush you. This is the very different approach, you should say, between God's kingdom and Satan's kingdom. One is by invitation, by reasoning, by entering into discourse, trying to understand, trying to lead you in the right way, trying to invite you to a relationship. And another one, quite frankly, is just waiting for any opportunity to ambush you, to take over, and to rule over you. So, we're told that sin lieth at the door, its desire is for you, but you should rule over it. Now, one of the things is that a lot of people have linked this to the very verse that came before it, where Eve had sinned, and because of sin, God says to Adam that her desire shall be for you, and you shall rule over her. That's made a lot of people uncomfortable, that these two exact same phrases are repeated within these two contexts. But I'd like to explain that for just a minute. Now, in order to explain this, I want to go and explain a phrase real quick in relation to Adam and Eve. Now, Adam and Eve were created for one another. They were both created together to represent God. And so one without the other doesn't quite complete the picture. So when it says that it is not good for man to be alone, I will make him an helpmeet, the word there, helpmeet, is etzer kenigdo. And what that means is, in essence, a help that stands against him. So how does that help if the person that God created is meant to stand against? Well, I'd like you to think of it in kind of this terms. Not the most perfect illustration, but imagine that I've got, and you can see this with people as well, and that probably would be better, but imagine I've got two planks here, all right? If I keep one like this and I try to get it to stand up, it'll fall over. If I have two planks and I lean them one against another, it's that tension of one pushing against the other that keeps them standing. In essence, I guess you could say this is a very simplified version of what etzer kenigdo means. But in a different sense, I'd like you to think of two people, and two people putting their hands together. And if the pressure is equal, then the hands move upward or forward. All right, something you can't do with planks, but something dynamic like people, it's the pressure that creates the forward movement. Now, what happened with sin is that now the woman has a very different view on life because of the entry of sin. And this balance that was once like this is now being pushed towards one side, and forward movement is lost. That momentum has been broken. And so what God has said is that her desire shall be for you, or her desire to rule you will be for you, but you should rule over her. So does that mean you push towards the opposite direction to dominate her? I don't think so. By suppressing the other person, you actually lose dominion. You lose that forward momentum. Whether you're dominated or whether you are the one dominating, that forward momentum is lost. I like to think of Proverbs chapter 16, verses 32, where it says that he that ruleth himself is greater than he that taketh a city. He that has rule over his own spirit. And so what I understand is that being able to have dominion over oneself, to not be like an animal that gives into impulses, to be able to have self-restraint, self-control, which is one of the fruits of the Spirit, I remind you, that through that, maintaining control or dominion of oneself, one will not over-exceed his authority or dominion over another. God says, I want to restore you to the type of dominion that you had when I created you. Not the type of dominion that exercises some level of domination, control, or suppression. That's not what existed in the garden. Adam was tasked with responsibility. And when you're responsible for someone that is different from you, that sees things differently from you, and yet you're asked to take care of them, to guide them, to help them, to be that helpmeet, that whatever level of opposition exists, whatever level of tension exists, it's one that drives you forward. God created us to be different, but He created us to be different so that we can understand community. We cannot be like Him outside of community. It is through relationship, through that tension, through the uniqueness that exists in each person and personality, that we actually learn to be more God-like. Oftentimes, the reason that we don't get along with other people is because, quite frankly, we don't have control over ourselves. There's no dominion over ourselves. And so what do? We try to exercise authority or dominion over that other person to get them to be like us. But God says, I don't want other people to be like you. I want you to be like me. So if you want true dominion, if you truly want to do well, what you need is to answer the call. I stand at the door and knock. If God comes into your heart, if God comes into my heart, if Jesus, who is knocking, waiting to be received, comes into our heart, then he will teach us, he'll train us to have control over ourselves. And through self-dominion, through self-control, we will now exercise proper dominion and not coercion, not suppression or oppression, or any of the other things that are exemplified in the world. God says, that's not my way. That's not the way that I operate. So my challenge to you today is, are you willing to allow God to come into your heart so that he can help you have self-control, so that you don't exercise control over others?